So some of you know, and some of you grew up in similar places. I grew up surrounded by Bible Belt Christianity, right? Exuberant Christianity. Things like Benny Hinn, right? You know Benny Hinn, the great healer who would walk up to people and smack them on the head and they'd fall back, right? You probably saw him on TV. That was not uncommon in the area where I lived in. People who were very engaged in their faith and emotional in their faith and maybe a little over the top in their faith. And as we grew up in that space, as Lutherans looked around, we said, we may be a lot of things, but we're definitely not that. Lutherans are a lot of things. We're great with explaining our faith. We're great at engaging others in conversation about our faith. But at the end of the day, all that emotional stuff and all that personal story about my faith, we're not necessarily good at that. That's the trade-off sometimes, I think, right? And so we talk often about the reality that as we talk about a pastoral intern coming here, it's not even enough that our pastors have bachelor's degrees. We require them to have a master's degree and an internship on top of that. Right? We want well-educated preachers and clergy. But I think sometimes we miss that at the core of faith, throughout Scripture, is this encounter. This encounter between us and God in Jesus Christ. Right? We heard it twice this morning. So first, in the story of Saul, the great persecutor of the church, who encounters Jesus on the road, encounters the resurrected Jesus in a way that knocks him flat on his back, sets him blind with shock and awe. Ananias is sent to him, and I often wonder more about the story of Ananias, because I can't imagine that being sent to the guy who had killed your fellow believers was a good job, or a job that he wanted. But he went, and the thing is, after that encounter with Jesus, Saul is never the same, right? Saul becomes the one who spreads Christianity through his preaching across all of the Greek-speaking world at that time, extending all the way to the ends of the earth on that side to Spain. Transformed by an encounter with the risen Jesus. We talked about Thomas a couple weeks ago. You remember Thomas, right? Thomas is the one, I won't believe unless I see, right? Shows him the hands and the side and he sees. The story about Thomas is phenomenal. So when the first Western Europeans make their way all the way east to India, they find that there's Christians already there. Christians who claim themselves to be the Church of Thomas. Thomas, who was filled with questions and wonder and doubt, after encountering the risen Jesus, is transformed and with confidence carries the gospel message to the ends of the earth in the other direction. Cleopas and his companion today on the road to Emmaus, who don't recognize that it's Jesus that they meet, who recognize him not in the teaching and in the conversation, not in the learning, but in the breaking of the bread, in the encounter, in the meal, who say, were not our hearts on fire within us? Lutherans don't get on fire very often. We like smolder more than get on fire. I think we need to embrace that reality that we have all had these life-changing moments in our lives. Sure, many of us, like me, were baptized when we were 4 or 6 weeks old. But along the way, Jesus has encountered us in the pathways of life. Some of us came to faith later, and it was that encounter with Jesus that brought us to the waters of baptism. But they're there. If if you think back on your life, those moments of transformation in our lives that come after we meet the risen Christ. Now, I'm not going to say that I ever saw a flash of light and was knocked on my rear like Paul on the road to Damascus. That's not my story. Although I've heard stories like that, that's not my story. I was in 8th grade, and I had this group of elders in my church that had adopted me. You see, when you're a pastor's kid, you're always at church. It just happens. You go with dad, you leave with dad. You go with mom, you leave with mom. You're always there. And so this group of elders in the church adopted me and gathered me around the Sunday morning coffee table and would take care of me. It was me and the group of 70 or 80-year-old plus talking about life together. One particular family, Lawrence and Florence, they were the family that I would spend time with on a Saturday afternoon because my grandparents didn't live in town. They were the people with whom, when my parents went out of town, I would go and I would stay at Lawrence and Florence's house. They were my family. I was 14 years old when I realized, I'm sure everyone else knew longer, that Florence had terminal cancer. And I can remember walking into her ICU hospital room, and I walked in, and Florence lit up, and she smiled, and she said, "How are you today, hon?" She died a few months after that, but I'll tell you what, I was transformed in that encounter in that hospital room. It wasn't a flash of light. It wasn't a bolt of lightning. But in the love and compassion that I was shown by Florence, I was transformed into somebody who wanted to care for those in need. I wasn't always that. I bet you have moments like that. I bet you have lots. Right? So sometimes when people talk about these transformational moments, they talk about one big moment that saved and redeemed my life and transformed me when I met Jesus. I'll tell you what, it happens to me on the regular. When our eyes are open, we see Jesus around us all the time. The story of the road to Emmaus, they're walking along and Jesus is there, and he walks along with them for hours, talking through Scripture. I want the transcript of that Bible study. Right? But they don't know that it's Jesus. How many times in our lives have we been walking alongside Jesus and not known it? How many times have we been walking with somebody in the pathways of life who has shown us what love and compassion and generosity and mercy look like? How many times have we been transformed and renewed? How many times have we been walked to the waters of abundant life? One more thing about this story to Emmaus that I love. If you would ask me when I was 14 what was important about that hotel room visit, I would not have said what I said today. If you had asked me what was important, I would have said nothing. It was another day. I said I was sad. I said I miss my friend Florence. They're walking along to the road to Emmaus, and they only recognize Jesus after the fact. They only recognize Jesus after they gather in worship and reflect on everything that came beforehand. They only recognize Jesus looking backwards. I guarantee you, friends, Jesus has walked alongside you in your life. I guarantee you, there's not much in life that's a guarantee. I guarantee you that Jesus will walk alongside you in your life again. That's the promise of the story of Easter. Not that it happened once 2,000 years ago, but that it happens over and over and over again. That we continue to encounter the risen Christ in our lives. That God continues to transform us, to lead us toward the people that God calls us to be. That God continues to walk beside us toward God's kingdom. The thing about telling these stories is it's risky. Because if I encounter Jesus, what's the other part that goes with that in every one of these stories? I have to change. If I encounter Jesus, it's going to require something of me. If I admit that I have met Jesus, then why do I still do the things that I do? There's a vulnerability and a risk to meeting Jesus. Cleopas and his companion on the road, Thomas, Paul, none of them was ever the same. The risky, vulnerable encounter with Jesus changed them forever. Open our eyes. God is walking alongside us today.